Tonight we have Bruce Jacobson, who's the superintendent of the Boston Harbor Islands National Park, and Tom Powers, who's the president of the Boston Harbor Island Alliance. Together they work with a whole bunch of other people that you'll find out about on the Boston Harbor Islands National Park area, a unit of the National Park System. It includes 34 islands within the 50 square miles of Boston Harbor. Bruce Jacobson has professional experience in the non-governmental section and with the National Park Service. Prior to joining the Boston Harbor Islands in 1998, Bruce was the Chief of Planning and Land Resources at Acadia National Park in Maine. He also worked as a park planner and ranger at Acadia. Other work in conservation and environmental education involved professional positions with the Nature Conservancy, Maine Audubon Society, Girl Scouts of the USA, and other organizations. Throughout his career, Mr. Jacobson has worked with islands. He developed and conducted coastal island education programs, managed island nature sanctuaries, and counseled landowners regarding coastal island preservation. He worked with others to develop management plans for international parks on St. Croix in Maine and Campobello Island in New Brunswick. At Boston Harbor Islands, he has been working to connect coastal islands with an urban population. Mr. Jacobson earned a BS degree in Natural Resource Conservation at the University of Montana School of Forestry and an EDM in Human Resource Education from BU. Tom Powers was named president of the Island Alliance in June of 2004. He's responsible for raising funds to improve the park, developing and articulating alliance positions on matters involving the park and the harbor, works closely with the National Park Service to protect, promote, and preserve the Boston Harbor Islands National Park area. Mr. Powers is a veteran environmentalist. He was saying, wait a minute, don't say veteran. Doesn't mean old, it means experienced, with extensive experience on Boston Harbor issues. Prior to coming to the Island Alliance, he worked in both the private and public sectors, most recently as Director of External Relations and Environmental Affairs for U.S. Gen New England, and from 1996 to 99, he was Deputy Director of the Mass Water Resource Authority. Before that, he served in various positions in the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection over a 19-year period, including Acting Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner. Mr. Powers holds a BA degree from Oberlin College, a law degree from Harvard, and a master's in public administration from the JFK School of Government. Without further ado, we welcome Mr. Jacobson.
Didn't you? Well, welcome everyone. You have two jobs now.
I have two jobs now. You just give me a minute.
How many people have been to the Boston Harbor Islands? Okay, almost everyone. So hopefully this will be a review to get you excited to go out to the islands this season. We are going to, as you see here, talk a little bit about the park, give you an overview of the park and its resources, talk a little bit about this unique way that we manage this park, and Tom's going to do that portion. Go back and I'll talk about some of the highlights that we've accomplished since 1996. Tom will then talk about some of our major projects underway, and then we'll leave time for questions. So it wasn't just recently that we started thinking about the Boston Harbor Islands. Folks have been thinking about their beauty and their opportunities for recreation for a long time. Here you can see a quote of 1887 from Frederick Law Olmsted to the Boston Parks Commission in order to encourage them to use the islands for recreation. And, of course, we're down here in Boston. And just as for perspective, up here is Cape Cod. So we're really talking about this stretch of collection of 34 islands, an archipelago in greater Boston Harbor. This, in 1996, Congress added these islands to the National Park System. And, of course, this built on a long-standing relationship of management of some of the islands by the Commonwealth as part of Boston Harbor Islands State Park. But we expanded the geographic scope as well as some of the protections and programming that goes on the islands. And it's a new type of legislation that created a new type of park that we'll talk about. But we have 34 islands here. And in total, 3,500 acres of land. Of course, at high tide, it's only 1,600 acres. But those of us associated with the aquarium understand the importance of that intertidal zone. And so it about doubles the size of the park at low tide. There's a remarkable mix of natural and cultural resources out on these islands. We have 3 National Historic Landmarks. We have relatively undeveloped islands. And I'm not joking here. You heard that I was up at Acadia National Park. When you're on some of these outer islands and you look out to Massachusetts Bay, you could be at Acadia National Park. You really could. Then you walk around to the other side, there's downtown Boston on the skyline. So it's really a remarkable collection of resources. And we provide ferries to these islands, Spectacle Island and George's Island from the mainland at several locations. We go from downtown Boston as well as from Quincy and Hull. And this year also from the EDIC Pier on Saturdays, going out to Thompson Island. And then once you get to George's or Spectacle, there are inter-island shuttles that go to 4 other islands. So you have the opportunity, by buying a round-trip ticket, you can get out to the islands and back, and also travel between the islands. Okay, there we go. I'm going to use 4 different themes to talk a little bit about the islands in general. The islands are, the first of those themes being islands on the edge. And they're islands that are on the edge of the continent. They're at the place where land meets sea, and here where fresh water meets seawater. So we have the estuarine harbor. Boston Harbor is an estuary. And we have this mixing of fresh and salt water where the islands are surrounded by this mixture. We also have the place where when you stand on the islands and look back, you can see that we're also on the edge of the mainland. Okay, you're kind of this place. Roger Kennedy did a lecture at the library this spring where he talked about proximate wildness. Okay, so you're at this kind of these wild areas looking back at the developed shore. Also, these islands are at the edge of society over time. They're places where we've actually put things that, not in my backyard, places like dumps and sewage treatment plants, and even people in some cases in insane asylums or in quarantine hospitals. That's not to say that all of the social activities that went on out there, some of the hospitals were put there because it was thought to be a nourishing environment, because you had the fresh salt air and you're away from the city. But in many cases, we did put things out there that we didn't want to have associated with our backyards. Also, it's been a home in the harbor. The islands have been a home in the harbor for thousands of years for Native Americans who were here long before Europeans arrived, of course. And this is a special place for local tribes. It's also been a home in the harbor for the many institutions that were staffed on these islands, whether they be hospitals or lighthouses or life-saving stations or garbage dumps. If you go to Spectacle Island and look at the exhibit there about life on Spectacle, you'll hear about folks who worked on the garbage scows, and they lived and loved Spectacle Island. It's also a home for all kinds of other creatures in addition to people out on these islands. It's a relatively wild habitat and a place where we have particularly a remarkable collection of seabirds nesting on the islands. It's also an area of renewal and reconnection. You're all familiar with these digester eggs, and the reason that we're able to have a national park and invite people to go out and swim and walk the shore is because these digesters are helping to clean up Boston's harbor. So we have that whole story of renewal of the harbor. And also we have a lot of reconnection. We are now learning a lot about the connections that Native Americans have had to these islands, particularly Deer Island, where in the 1670s, many of the local Native Americans were rounded up by the colonial government and put out on islands like Deer Island without provision. About half of them starved, died of exposure. Others were sold into slavery. And this was all because of the King Philip's War and the concern that the colonial government had for the then friendly so-called praying Indians in the fear of the colonists of turning against them. So the Native Americans have reconnected to their past in the creation of this federal park. And we also have the opportunity for individuals to reconnect, to go to these islands on a weekend to recreate. Recreation is why we're out in places like national parks, to make our own personal connections, to places like the Boston Harbor Islands. And of course, we also have the sustainability and the renewable resources that we might be able to take advantage of on the islands. Portal to New England is the fourth theme. These islands have been the gateway to the largest port in New England for several centuries. And if we were to, even today, it still remains an active shipping port and is one of the busiest harbors in New England. And because of all that shipping, we needed to have aids to navigation, ways to avoid rocks. Rocks and boats don't mix. And so this is one of the oldest aids to navigation in the United States, called Nix's Mate. It's still an active aid maintained by the United States Coast Guard, one of the islands in the park. Also, coastal defense. These islands were critical in defending that important roadway in and out of New England, the waterway that brought goods and people. These islands were, almost all the islands were used to defend the harbor, for harbor defense, such as here, George's Island. Also, okay, so those are our four themes. Gives you a broad general overview of the park. Now, who comes to the park? Who are our visitors? Primarily, it's people who are in small groups, family groups, or small church groups, neighborhoods. They come because they want to go for a boat ride. They want to get out in the harbor. About 40% come just to see Boston, because the views are spectacular when you're out in the harbor. And then another 44% just want to get away from their normal routine. So they come out and see the Boston Harbor Islands. When they're here, they engage in what typically you would do in parks: sightseeing, picnicking, hiking, going to historical sites. And in 2005, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 325,000 visitors. These are the islands they went to. Actually, one of the most popular islands is Deer Island, which is connected by a road to Winthrop. So there's a lot of day use there. The next most popular is George's Island, which most folks would have guessed would have been the most popular. And in 2005, our ridership on the boats was up about 40% over 2004. So we're seeing an upward swing. Most of our visitors come from Metro Boston, the immediate area of Boston. Suburban Boston adds another 26%. So about 80% of our visitors come from Boston. And if you just look here, you can see that other states are about 14%. Keep punching through these. Other New England states, about 3%. So you begin to get the sense that we're really serving our neighborhood here. It's within the Interstate 495, which is really our visitors. George's Island, Civil War era fort, actually was used during the Civil War for prisoners of war of the Confederacy. It's a magical place if you've never been. And it's a place where a lot of folks go with groups for group picnics, whether they be church groups or neighborhoods or corporate outings. A much different island is Grape Island. It feels much more wild. It's smaller, more intimate. And on Grape Island, actually you can go walk down to the end of Long Wharf here, or to right next door, and get off the blue line and walk to the boat on the other side of the Marriott with your camping gear. And you can go camping in a national park by taking the subway. And you can camp on Grape Island or 3 other islands in the park. Little Brewster Island, site of the oldest light station in America, built in 1716, a National Historic Landmark. And we, the big we, the National Park Service, the Island Alliance, the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands, bring people out. And you're able to climb the 76 spiral stairs to the very top of the Lantern House and actually stand next to the Fresnel lens and look out and make believe you're that light shining 27 miles out to sea. So how do we do all this? We do it through a partnership called the Boston Harbor Islands Partnership. I'm going to introduce that partnership to you. It coordinates the management of the park. And our mission is to protect the resources of the park in perpetuity for future generations and to provide quality visitor experiences. Our partnership is made up of 13 members representing these organizations. If you look on the left, there's 3 state entities: the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, and Massport. On the right-hand side at the top, 2 federal agencies, the National Park Service and the U.S. Coast Guard. 2 city agencies, BRA and the Environment Department. Across the bottom, 3 nonprofits, the Island Alliance, the Trustees of Reservations, and Thompson Island Outward Bound. And then at the top, 2 seats for the Boston Harbor Islands Advisory Council. And of those agencies, there's actually 7 that provide visitor services directly to the public. And these are the 7 that are actually providing services to the public. So what do? These agencies that are directly serving the public, particularly the island owners, are responsible for all of the management of those important resources, those natural resources, those historical sites. They provide visitor service, so education and interpretation. And the Department of Conservation and Recreation is the organization that owns more islands than any other. They own about half the islands in the park. Grape, Bumpkin, Pettix, Lovels, Georges, and half of Spectacle. The National Park Service, I want to tell you a little bit about our role. We support the partnership, so we provide the administrative support, kind of the glue to keep it all going. We also support the Advisory Council, which is a 28-member organization that advises the partnership. Okay. We also consult with Native American Indian tribes, particularly federally recognized tribes, but really all tribes, whether they're federally recognized or not, because of the critical importance of these islands to Native Americans in Massachusetts and elsewhere, actually, throughout New England and the East. We've been responsible for taking the lead on science programs in the park and also working with the Island Alliance to develop curriculum-based education and providing visitor information and orientation. If you walk that direction when you leave here tonight, you'll see a small white kiosk that says Harbor Islands Information, and that's a service that the National Park Service provides here on Long Wharf. The Island Alliance supports the park and was actually created prior to the establishment of the park. The Island Alliance was an organization that was formed to get federal legislation passed in order to create Boston Harbor Islands National Park Area. And when the park was created, Congress said, well, Island Alliance, you have a special job. Your job is to provide funding from the private sector in order to make this park work. Oh, and I need to pin you.
Momentary break here. Great. Pardon this cord here. Thanks very much, Bruce. We thought it'd be useful to talk just a little bit about some of the features that make the Boston Harbor Islands National Park area unique. Since it is the 10-year anniversary of the park, it's a good time to look back at what's been accomplished and sort of why it was created in the first place. And one of the things that makes it unique is this partnership concept. It sort of sounds like a buzzword, and you think, well, what does that really mean? It also, it seems to me, sort of raises the question, well, why would you do that? Why did they even bother with that in the first place? And the answer really is in 1996, when there was getting to be significant steam to protect these wonderful islands that people were just becoming aware of and really focusing on, because the cleanup of the harbor had made people really think about the harbor much more than they had. Congress was really not in a mood to add a lot of federal spending to the budget and sort of think about new parks and new management. There was also the issue of, you're going to tell the city of Boston, we don't need your role anymore, the federal government's going to come in and handle it. So this is a very unusual park. The Park Service does not own any of the islands. You think about the one, when we think of a national park in Yellowstone or Glacier or Acadia, we tend to think of land that the federal government owns. In this case, federal Congress said, we'll put in $1 for every $3 that your local match can come up with, city, state government, nonprofits, private sector. But other than that, we're going to leave ownership on the local level and figure out this partnership concept. And when you first look at the partnership concept in those tables that Bruce was showing with 13 different, actually 11 different entities, 13 seats, you think, boy, oh boy, that sounds incredibly complicated. How in the world could anybody ever get anything done? And the good news is it actually works better than you might think looking at that, partly because the hard work of the general management plan, which Bruce will describe in a minute, has been done, so the kind of roadmap is laid out, but also because The only people on the partnership that think every day about what do we do to make the Boston Harbor Islands better are the National Park Service and the Island Alliance. Everybody else has a lot of other things to worry about, so they pay attention to this, particularly their own particular niche. But it's really the two of us and whoever's niche it is that's at stake at a particular time that really focus on each issue, which makes it a little more manageable than it might have been. So in a lot of ways, it actually works better than you might think. On the other hand, if I had a slide up here, not to seem negative, but I think I would probably say something like partnerships can be hard because they're a real challenge as to whether you work on and appreciate the other guy's strengths or whether you're just sort of annoyed that they're not more like you. And so we all have different particular strengths. Obviously, government has a lot of things it does well and sort of resources, sometimes at least have access to resources. But other things they're not so good at, moving quickly, for instance, and prompt decision making. And the idea is to kind of marry the strengths of both of us. One of the challenges for a nonprofit group like us or the Aquarium or any of the nonprofits these days, as we're trying to get philanthropic dollars, is to convince donors that this is money going for something that shouldn't be something government would fund and you're not just kind of making up for tax dollars. So I, all the time when I'm out talking to people, sort of hear but isn't this something government should do? Why should we give money to that? And the answer is we try very hard to add above the base level, be the margin of excellence, the things that wouldn't happen otherwise. And with our government partners, we try to explain to them that the philanthropic world doesn't want to just give money to make up for what they should be doing and then you get into tax policy and the political side of things, but very important to be able to convince donors that we're adding to the basics. On the other hand, groups like the Island Alliance can have huge advantages. We can act much more quickly than government, and we can do things like marketing. One of the Island Alliance's sort of core missions is to make people more aware of the islands and to market them. And that's really something that it's tough for government to do. People often feel like that sort of advertising, it's PR, it's really not something that the government ought to be in the business of doing. But if you're going to try and get people out to a new resource, at least new to them, you have to make them aware of it. And the way you have to do that is marketing. Maybe just to close this section, to use a brief example of that. It's always easier to tell a story than just sort of talk generalities. One of our signature programs is the Lighthouse at Little Brewster. Bruce showed some pictures of that. It's a great program to get on a boat, go out for 3.5 hours. There are lightkeepers in costume. It's the oldest lighthouse and last manned lighthouse, or woman lighthouse in this case, on the East Coast. And really a great place to go. The Island Alliance manages that program. We pay for a dock, which actually is a combination of Massport and the Park Service and the Coast Guard, being towed out every year. Last year, that dock got put in place in May, as it always does, and the spring nor'easter came by and wrapped the cables all around, so it was unusable. And so we were looking at the possibility that nobody would be able to go to Little Brewster. 3,000 people or so, tourists from international countries who do one thing on the Harbor Islands, go out to see the lighthouse, would not be able to go. And it was pretty clear that in the normal course of government affairs, it would take 3 to 6 months to get all the approvals, check through the budget, do the procurement, get more approvals and so forth, and would be ready just in time for the closure of the park. The Island Alliance has the ability to just kind of borrow the money from ourselves, tell the contractor, go out and fix it, and we'll worry about paying for it later. And so that's what we did because it seemed so central to the park. And it was fixed 10 days later. Nobody noticed anything, and school groups and local groups and tourists from international countries all enjoyed the Little Brewster experience last year. And the good news of part of that is Bruce and the Park Service worked through all this, and the money actually came back to the Island Alliance. It was $40,000, a significant amount of money for us, by the beginning of October, which is just about when the park would have closed otherwise. But a sort of example of partnerships really working very well together. So with that, Bruce, let me hand it over to you. We're going to talk a little bit about what's happened in the last 10 years and what we might expect over the next 10. Yeah, really. You work a lot.
So what have we done in the last 10 years? Well, we've written some reports, which actually was a major accomplishment, and one of those is the General Management Plan. And this is a document which all of the partners have agreed to, all of the folks sitting around the table have agreed for a basic foundation of decision-making for the park. So we all agree on what our mission is: protect resources, provide quality visitor experiences. And we've all agreed on general policies that would implement that mission so that we have a common understanding of where we're heading and a general idea of how we're going to get there. One of the other important things about the General Management Plan is that we looked at every island in the park and we came up with geographic zoning for the park. So we said that some areas are best as natural areas, some are best managed for their historic resources, others should provide visitor services and very active visitor support areas. So think about an area like Little Brewster, historic resource, National Historic Landmark, so that's its emphasis. Think about the dock at George's Island, visitor services. There might be 1,000 people there on a day. So we did that for every island, and there were 4 different categories that we came up with, and so there's a geographic zoning for the park. We also, in developing the General Management Plan, did an extensive outreach and involved the public in this process. I know some people in this room attended some of those public meetings and wrote back to give us comment on the General Management Plan. Beyond that, some of the other highlights of the last 10 years is that we've improved ferry service. We have a new contractor that provides service to the Boston Harbor Islands, and last year they invested private dollars to buy 2 new ferry boats, which ran for the first time just at the end of the season last year. So our ferry service is improved, and one of the things that happened in the last 10 years also is that the Island Alliance agreed to manage the boat transportation for the park. Events and marketing. Tom mentioned that often government can't or doesn't advertise or market. It's actually illegal for me to go out and place ads as a federal entity to advertise Boston Harbor Islands National Park. But the Island Alliance can do that. So starting in 2003, the Island Alliance, through a grant, hired a full-time marketing and events manager to increase awareness and visitation to the park. We also have developed a full branding campaign. We have this logo that you see you've been seeing on all of the slides to identify the park, to get the public to recognize that as a symbol of Boston Harbor Islands. Free programming out on George's Island. We have 34 days of free programming this summer for families. Plus, every Friday we have a event for school kids with the Boston Children's Theater. And kids are very important. That was one of the real things that everyone coalesced around in developing the General Management Plan, that youth is an important resource, that we want to get out, and we want to get the kids out on the islands. So the National Park Service and the Island Alliance have taken the lead to develop curriculum-based programming so that we actually go in the schools, work with teachers, do in-classroom site visits, post-visit in the classroom again. And these curriculum are put up on a website at bostonislands.com/learn, and we are able to get kids out as part of their school day. Also, for many years, there have been school field trips out to the islands, and those continue to go on. For those of you who grew up in the Boston area, how many of you as a kid went out to George's Island? There's just only 2 or 3 in the room tonight. Usually, if folks have gone out to the islands, they went out as part of a school group. And these kinds of trips happen in the springtime, usually, when it's like, what am I going to do now? And so the teacher takes the kids out, which is an important, a valuable experience. But it's a little different than the curriculum-based programs that we also develop. Youth programs. The National Park Service has funded programs to get kids out in the park to work, to do work projects, cleaning trails, painting fences, painting buildings, and also to learn about the park. The Youth Conservation Corps is a learning and work program, and we have these set up 5 different camps around. We work with a couple of other national parks so that the kids go down to Cape Cod, and they also spend time in the Boston Harbor Islands. Also the BEAN program, the Boston Environmental Ambassadors to National Parks, named by the kids. This is an after-school program that the Island Alliance and the National Park Service jointly conduct. It's actually based at our office down here on Atlantic Avenue. And these kids come in after school. They apply. We have about 15 to 18 kids a year. And they actually develop programs to work with younger kids. They've got some grant funding, so they actually give mini grants to schools. So the school kids come up with ideas. Our ambassadors then review all the grant proposals and might fund a school trip out or a party on a boat that lands on an island or all kinds of activities. And these kids that come out in these programs are really an important part of our population. They're urban kids. They're from a wide array of ethnic and economic backgrounds. This is one of the best programs we've got going in the park. Resource stewardship. National Park Service has spent about $2 million to begin to inventory the resources, the natural resources of this park. There really had been no comprehensive look at the park's ecological systems prior to establishment of the federal park. We also have established some carrying capacity for the islands. In the general management planning process, at the public meetings, a lot of people said, we're going to love these islands to death. We're going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And so we've addressed that in the general management plan and spent quite a bit of time and money to figure out what is the appropriate level of use for the various islands. Just a quick example of how we're trying to think about protecting these islands for the future. Thompson Island is owned by Thompson Island Outward Bound. They're an educational institution. Okay, so their mission is a little different from a park. We're here to primarily protect this land and these resources forever. They're interested in educating kids. So the kind of the line of thinking was, well, what if 20 years from now or 50 years from now, Thompson Island decides that they could serve their kids better someplace else, outward bound? What if they were to sell the island and it were to be developed for, a Hilton hotel or, condos? And we didn't want that to happen. So the National Park Service said, we'll step forward with $2 million. The state came forward with $2 million. And we said, we would like to buy the development rights to Thompson Island. And Thompson Island said, that would be great, but the development rights, according to a fair market appraisal, is worth $5 million, almost $6 million. And so Thompson Island then contributed the $1 million. So for $4 million, we purchased the development right to Thompson Island so that those resources will be protected for the public. And that conservation easement also allows public access, and we're currently doing that every Saturday. Another important project that I'm excited about is looking at the invertebrates in the park. Now, if you think about a national park, think about the wildlife. What do you think of? Grizzly bears, elk, moose, alligators, you bet. Well, we don't really have those in the Boston Harbor Islands. But we have what E.O. Wilson calls the micro-wilderness. We have, if you were to pick up a handful of soil on the Boston Harbor Islands, there's thousands of animals in your hand. And so what we're doing, we launched with E.O. Wilson as our mentor and working with the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, we've launched the first ever complete inventory of invertebrates on the Boston Harbor Islands, the first ever in a national park. And so we're looking at the insects and the other invertebrates that live on the islands, and we're trying to identify every species that lives there. And it's likely that we will find many surprises, and we're hopeful and guessing that we probably will find species that are new to science. And we have a postdoctoral student at Harvard who's managing this project for us, and we're involving the public in these events. In fact, 2 weekends ago, we had a beetle blitz on Thompson Island where the public was invited to come out and work with scientists to find as many beetles as we could in 24 hours. And we had a lab set up with microscopes to identify what was there. And everything that was caught, identified, and sampled is brought back to Harvard. And there's a permanent collection at Harvard University for the Boston Harbor Islands where we're going to keep these samples, voucher specimens of every species that we locate. So I talked too long about that slide, but it's an exciting project. No, it's all of the islands. We won't be visiting every single island because we just don't have the resources to do that, but we've picked representative islands. Another important thing that we've done since '96 is to improve the infrastructure of the islands, particularly regarding transportation. DCR built a new dock at Pettix, about a $2 million project. Deer Island has a new dock that is available to the public. That changed a little bit after 9/11, but The dock is there. At Spectacle Island, handicap accessible floats put in by the Big Dig. And the National Park Service has funded new floats and ramps at Grape, Levels, and Bumpkin Island. Again, they're ADA accessible, so that we're improving access in many ways to the islands. Also, the DCR had a new boat built just for the Boston Harbor Islands called the Abigail, and we use that a lot to get students out, and they also use it for some of their employees to get out. And of course, we can't talk about what's happened in the last 10 years and ignore Spectacle Island, because it was transformed from a leaching landfill to a public park. And you can see the dark brown line on the bottom was the profile of Spectacle Island if you were to kind of look at it from water view. That was the old profile, and then the light color is the fill from the Big Dig that was put on top of a capped landfill. So Spectacle Island is now the highest point in the harbor, and it has spectacular views. In addition, the Big Dig, it's going to be a transportation hub for the harbor, and in addition, the Big Dig constructed a new pier. We have a brand new visitor center, actually the only visitor center located on the islands, with great new exhibits, 5 miles of trails, and tens of thousands of new trees and shrubs that are out there just waiting for you to come look at them. So we're going to transfer one more time here to major projects that are underway on the Boston Harbor Islands.
Thank you. So that's a lot that's happened over the last 10 years, what's going on now, and what might we expect over the next 10 years. Island Alliance's sole mission, the only reason we exist, is to promote the awareness and use of the Boston Harbor Islands National Park area. And that drives, at least for me, out of very much an environmental reason, which is Boston Harbor got terribly polluted and was a terrible eyesore and waste of a resource for all of us, because people really didn't pay attention to it. And it was out of sight, out of mind. It was sort of over there. Nobody really thought much about it and bothered to maintain the infrastructure that you need to keep it clean. It's very important that we not ever get ourselves back in that situation. The more people appreciate the islands, appreciate what the harbor can do and what it is, and go out there and use it, the less likely we will ever be back to a polluted harbor. So there's a real environmental core for our mission of thinking about how do we get more people out there. We tend to think in terms of 3 A's, kind of simple memory device to categorize what we do: awareness, access, and attractions. The first one, awareness, all of them are fairly obvious. Right? You're not going to get anybody if they don't know what's out there and they aren't aware of what they're going to find. So we try very hard to sort of get the word out. Marketing, you may see our placards on MBTA cars. We're trying to market all the time to newspapers. We are also in the process of building a new Harbor Park Pavilion on the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which will be the gateway on the Greenway to the Boston Harbor Islands National Park. It will give people a sense of what they will find out there. We'll sell ferry tickets, give them a real base point to leave for journeys out to the islands. You can click through the next 2 or 3. They're all move around. These sort of arrows showing the basic flow of pedestrian traffic from Faneuil Hall, from Long Wharf Marriott. There was one up there pointing out the aquarium and the aquarium subway stop right there. We are very hopeful that this particular facility will very much make the islands much more in people's consciousness. That is not what it will look like. That's a artist rendition, sort of a concept. We did a design competition last year and picked a winning designer who won the first prize with his view of a shimmering glass box. It will also not be that. It turns out shimmering glass boxes are very expensive to both build and operate. But we have told him, with the aid of some recent grants, one from the Mass Turnpike Authority, to begin designing and start work. And so we are very much actively in the fundraising mode for that right now. Second thing you have to have once you make people aware and you give them a base to leave from is good transportation service. You really have to get people out to the islands safely, reliably, and be able to guarantee they'll get back. As Bruce said, we're very excited. This is the first year we are going to have these 2 new high-speed catamaran ferries. They can get to the islands in 20 minutes, and in fact, Spectacle is 10 minutes. Amazingly enough, a beautiful island literally 10 minutes from where we are right now. And so within an hour, it can get to George's, drop people at Spectacle, and be back at the dock here, very much making service and sort of jaunting out to the islands and back relatively quickly, much more doable than it ever has been in the past. I like to say we've basically reeled in George's Island half the distance that it used to be because it did take 45 minutes before. Now, this is just sort of a series of shots of Spectacle over the course of the transformation. That was the visitor center. This is a little shade shelter up at the top, and that is an aerial view of Spectacle not long ago, although I can tell you from having been out there last Tuesday night, it is even more beautiful than that now, and getting ever more so as the vegetation grows in, particularly if you have 25 inches of rain in May and June. It's really green out there. You do want to take your mallet for the mosquitoes or a good insect repellent. This is an aerial shot of Pettix Island, another long-term project of ours. Pettix, one of the most beautiful of Boston Harbor Islands, home to Fort Andrews, a crumbling turn-of-the-century fort, 30 buildings or so. Long-term vision is to rehab a number of those, knock down the ones that are not salvageable, turn it into tent platforms, something like the island of St. John in the Caribbean, an events tent, a theater, parade ground, open space. The Island Alliance is managing a $5.3 million environmental mitigation commitment that came to us through the Secretary of Environmental Affairs to get utilities out there. And one of the sort of commentaries on modern construction projects, it's taken 2.5 to 3 years to do the studies and get the permits. It will take 3 months, and it will be finished in August to actually do the drilling and bring all these utilities, power, water, wastewater, and communications over from Hull. And then sort of more short-term things to really try and get people excited right now. We initiated last year the first Boston Harbor Islands Regatta. This year will be the second on September 30th, headquartered on George's Island. It's a great course. It makes a figure eight, starting at George's, out around Outer Brewster, loops back around George's, comes down the other way around Rainsford, finishes at George's. If you're up on the ramparts, for those of you who have been out on the islands, you get a spectacular view of the entire race and the islands from standing on the top of Fort Andrews at George's Island. And on a beautiful late fall day or mid-fall day, it's really a great thing to do. Hopefully, again, encouraging people to come out and see the resources of the islands. So all that is sort of in the reasonably near term, at least. We also think a lot about what's the big idea, the longer term. We have tried hard to think of the magic bullet, and because our mentor park is Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. They have a partnership sort of arrangement similar to ours with the National Park Service. They have one big advantage, which is Alcatraz. And in Alcatraz, if you've been out there, they scalp tickets on weekdays. You have to pay extra, all the boats are full, and it's really a terrific thing. We're still looking for our Alcatraz. But some mix of these things, hopefully, will really be part of what drives people to the islands. Concerts and plays, some kind of performance center on Spectacle or Pettix or both. Perhaps a year-round artist colony, a conference center at Pettix, restaurants, wind power. I'm very interested in sort of doing our part to be part of the 21st century renewable energy movement as we try to move people away from dependence on fossil fuels. And one of the most beautiful islands in the harbor is Gallops Island, which unfortunately is now closed to the public because of asbestos problems from military use in the 50s. Also home to giant rabbits, which are very cute and no threat, and apparently thrive there. All of these are sort of ideas. We continue to work with all people who are interested in the harbor islands to look for ways to excite people about all the potential that is there on the island. The one thing you do not see on this list, which is worth at least noting, those of you who follow the newspapers, is a liquefied natural gas terminal on Outer Brewster. Those of you who follow this know that one has been proposed as legislation in the state legislature. Our view has been that much as we are acutely aware of the importance of energy, importance of clean energy, which natural gas certainly is compared to coal or oil. We set national parks aside for future generation to try and preserve them for our children and their children. And at the very least, we think you really ought to look long and hard at other options before you ever thought about using a national park. So we are confident that there are enough other good ideas out there that it will be possible to meet our energy needs without having to sacrifice one of the islands in the national park. And with that, we will stop talking and at least give you a chance to ask some questions.
Also, would point out that if you didn't get them on the way in, there are a number of brochures out here about the boat schedule and some of the things happening on the islands. We also have a couple copies of the PowerPoint presentation if anybody's interested. But any questions?
And you know, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't point out this one, which is how you can contribute to the national park through the Island Alliance. Our kind of donor brochure, new this year, sort of talking about some of the things going on the island. So I would encourage you, if they run out, feel free to tell me, give me your card, and I'll mail you one.
Yes, sir.